Welcome to the Discourse Analyzer AI Toolkit, where articles come alive. You're listening to the audio version of our article. For the full text and an interactive experience, check out the link in the description below. Interact with any selection using our AI assistant to enhance your understanding. Let's explore.
Political identities in discourse analysis. Political identities refer to the ways in which individuals and groups define themselves in relation to political ideologies, movements, parties, or positions. In discourse analysis, political identities are understood as socially constructed through language, shaped by how individuals express their political beliefs, affiliations, and values. Political discourse plays a key role in constructing and negotiating these identities, as it reflects how people align themselves with certain ideologies, assert their group belonging, and engage in political debates. Discourse analysis of political identities examines how language is used to construct self and other, how political labels and ideologies are framed, and how identity is both a personal and collective experience that is articulated and contested in public discourse. Political identities are not static. They are continuously shaped and reshaped through discourse as individuals and groups respond to changing political, social, and cultural contexts. Key features of political identities in discourse analysis. Point 1. Construction of in-group and out-group identities. Political discourse often constructs a clear distinction between in-groups, the speaker's own group, and out-groups, those seen as opponents or outsiders. Language is used to establish solidarity within the in-group and to delegitimize or oppose the out-group. These divisions can be based on ideology, political affiliation, nationality, or other identity markers. Example: in U.S. political discourse, Democrats and Republicans often construct each other as the outgroup. For instance, Republicans might frame Democrats as socialists or un-American, while Democrats might depict Republicans as extremists or out of touch with modern values. Discourse analysis would explore how this language reinforces political polarization by defining political identities through opposition and conflict. Point 2. Political identity through rhetorical strategies. Rhetorical strategies such as appeals to shared values, historical references, and emotional appeals are often used in political discourse to construct and maintain political identities. Politicians and political movements use these strategies to align themselves with particular ideologies and to represent their supporters' interests. Example: in campaign speeches, politicians often emphasize national identity and shared values. A politician might use phrases like, "we, the American people," or "our shared values of freedom and democracy," to construct a political identity that is inclusive of their audience while excluding those seen as a threat to these values, e.g., immigrants, foreign powers. Discourse analysis would examine how these rhetorical strategies create a collective political identity and solidify loyalty among supporters. Point 3. Use of labels and categorization. The use of labels is a significant discursive tool in constructing political identities. Political actors and the media often label individuals or groups in ways that reflect certain ideological positions, values, or beliefs. These labels serve to categorize people and define their political identities, often with positive or negative connotations. Example: terms like liberal, conservative, patriot, radical, or populist are frequently used to categorize political identities. Discourse analysis would focus on how these labels are used strategically to either legitimize or delegitimize individuals and groups. For instance, a political leader might label their opponent as radical to discredit them, framing their views as extreme or dangerous, while positioning themselves as moderate and rational. Point 4. Narratives of political identity. Political identities are often constructed through narratives that tell stories about the self, the group, or the nation. These narratives can be historical, personal, or ideological and serve to explain why certain political positions are held. They provide a framework for understanding political events, alignments, and conflicts. Example: nationalist movements often construct political identities by invoking historical narratives about the nation's past glory, struggles, or injustices. For example, Brexit discourse in the UK frequently drew on the narrative of Britain as a historically independent and sovereign nation. Discourse analysis would explore how this narrative constructed a political identity around national sovereignty, self-determination, and resistance to external control, e.g., the European Union. Point 5. Intersectionality of political identities. Political identities are often intersectional, shaped by overlapping aspects of an individual's or group's social identities such as race, gender, class, or religion. Discourse analysis explores how these intersections influence political identities and how individuals negotiate multiple layers of identity in political discourse. Example: in feminist movements, discourse often addresses the intersection of gender and race, constructing political identities that reflect the unique experiences of women of color. Discourse analysis would explore how political identities are articulated in terms of both gender and racial justice, reflecting a broader critique of both patriarchy and systemic racism. Point 6. Identity construction through social media and digital platforms. In the digital age, social media plays a significant role in shaping political identities. Online discourse allows individuals to express and reinforce their political beliefs and affiliations, often through hashtags, memes, and personal narratives. Political movements frequently use social media to build collective identities and create solidarity among supporters. Example: the hashtag Black Lives Matter movement uses social media to construct a political identity centered on racial justice, solidarity, and activism against police violence. Discourse analysis would explore how hashtags like hashtag Say Her Name or hashtag I Can't Breathe function as tools for collective identity construction, uniting individuals around shared experiences of racial injustice. Methods for analyzing political identities in discourse analysis. Point 1. Critical discourse analysis, CDA. Critical discourse analysis, CDA, focuses on how political identities are constructed, reinforced, and contested in relation to power structures. CDA examines how language in political discourse reflects broader ideological struggles and how certain political identities are legitimized while others are marginalized. Example: a CDA of populist rhetoric might explore how political leaders construct an identity for the people versus the elite. By analyzing speeches or social media posts, discourse analysts would examine how language is used to position the speaker as the voice of the common people and frame the elite as corrupt or disconnected from ordinary citizens. Point 2. Framing analysis. Framing analysis is used to examine how political identities are shaped by the framing of issues, individuals, and groups. By analyzing how certain political groups or ideologies are framed, discourse analysts can uncover how identities are constructed, whether as protectors of the nation, defenders of democracy, or disruptors of the status quo. Example: in debates over immigration, framing analysis might reveal how one side frames immigrants as hardworking contributors to the economy, constructing a political identity around inclusivity and diversity. The opposing side might frame immigrants as illegal or criminals, constructing a political identity around national security and border protection. Discourse analysis would explore how these competing frames shape political identities and public perceptions. Point 3. Narrative analysis. Narrative analysis focuses on how political identities are constructed through stories and personal accounts. Political discourse often relies on narratives to explain why certain political actions are taken and to justify the speaker's political stance. Example: in analyzing political speeches or manifestos, narrative analysis might focus on how politicians tell stories about the nation's history, struggles, or future goals to create a collective political identity. A narrative about restoring the American dream could construct a political identity centered on economic opportunity and individual success, appealing to voters who see themselves as part of this national story. Point 4. Metaphor analysis. Metaphor analysis explores how metaphors in political discourse shape the construction of political identities. Metaphors can simplify complex political ideologies and make them more accessible, while also reinforcing certain identities and values. Example: in political discourse, metaphors like draining the swamp, used in populist rhetoric, or fighting for the soul of the nation, used in democratic campaigns, construct identities of leadership and moral righteousness. Discourse analysis would focus on how these metaphors frame political actors as saviors or defenders, shaping public understanding of their political roles and identities. Examples of political identities in discourse analysis. Example 1. Populist political identity. Populist movements often construct political identities by positioning themselves as the voice of the common people against corrupt elites. Discourse analysis of speeches by leaders like Donald Trump or Viktor Orban might reveal how language is used to construct an identity for their supporters as the true patriots or defenders of national sovereignty, while casting elites, intellectuals, and immigrants as the outgroup. Phrases like the forgotten people or draining the swamp serve to create a shared identity that is oppositional and built on the idea of reclaiming power from those who are seen as corrupt. Example 2. Feminist political identity. Feminist discourse constructs political identities around the struggle for gender equality, often emphasizing the intersectionality of gender with race, class, and sexuality. Discourse analysis of feminist movements like #MeToo would focus on how the movement constructs an identity for survivors of sexual violence, empowering them to speak out and challenge patriarchal power structures. The use of personal narratives and collective slogans, e.g., "Believe Women," serves to create a political identity centered on solidarity, resistance, and justice. Example 3. Nationalist identity in Brexit discourse. In the UK, the Brexit referendum saw the construction of a political identity centered on national sovereignty, independence, and resistance to external control. Discourse analysis of pro-Brexit campaigns would examine how language framed the European Union as a threat to British identity and sovereignty, using slogans like, "Take back control." This language constructed a nationalist identity that appealed to voters' sense of historical independence and fear of losing cultural and political autonomy. Example 4. Environmental activism and political identity. Environmental movements, such as those around climate change, construct political identities based on activism and a sense of moral responsibility for the planet. Discourse analysis of the Fridays for Future movement, led by Greta Thunberg, might explore how the movement constructs an identity for its supporters as climate warriors or defenders of the future. The movement's discourse emphasizes urgency, youth leadership, and the moral imperative to act, constructing a political identity around environmental justice and generational responsibility. Challenges in analyzing political identities through discourse. Point 1. Complexity and fluidity of identity. Political identities are often fluid and complex, shaped by multiple factors such as culture, ideology, and social experience. Discourse analysts must be careful to account for the dynamic nature of political identities and avoid reducing them to fixed categories. Point 2. Ideological bias. Discourse analysts must remain aware of their own ideological biases when interpreting political identities. Reflexivity is essential to ensure that the analysis is based on the data rather than influenced by the analyst's personal political beliefs. Point 3. Contextual influences. The construction of political identities is heavily influenced by historical, social, and cultural contexts. Discourse analysts must carefully consider these contexts when analyzing political identities to avoid misinterpretation of the language and its meaning in different settings. Conclusion. Political identities are constructed, contested, and negotiated through discourse, reflecting how individuals and groups align themselves with certain ideologies, values, and social roles. By analyzing the language, labels, narratives, and metaphors used in political discourse, discourse analysts can uncover how political identities are formed and maintained, how in-groups and out-groups are constructed, and how political actors use language to mobilize support, define their opponents, and shape public opinion. Whether examining populist movements, feminist activism, or nationalist campaigns, discourse analysis provides valuable insights into the role of language in shaping political identities and influencing political dynamics. Frequently asked questions. What are political identities in discourse analysis? Political identities refer to how individuals or groups define themselves through political affiliations, ideologies, and movements. In discourse analysis, political identities are seen as socially constructed and shaped through language. By examining political discourse, analysts explore how identities are formed, negotiated, and contested in political settings. How does discourse analysis examine in-group and out-group dynamics in political identities? Discourse analysis investigates how language creates distinctions between in-groups, the speaker's own group, and out-groups, opponents or outsiders. This division is often based on political ideologies or affiliations, and it helps reinforce solidarity within the in-group while delegitimizing the out-group. What role do rhetorical strategies play in constructing political identities? Rhetorical strategies like emotional appeals, references to shared values, and historical events help build political identities. Politicians use these strategies to align themselves with particular ideologies and construct a collective identity around their supporters. How are labels used to shape political identities in discourse? Labels such as liberal, conservative, patriot, or radical are key tools in political discourse. They serve to categorize individuals and groups, often with positive or negative connotations, thus shaping their political identity and influencing how others perceive them. What is the role of narratives in constructing political identities? Political identities are often constructed through narratives that tell stories about the self, the group, or the nation. These narratives provide context and justification for political beliefs and actions, helping individuals and groups align with specific political movements or ideologies. How does intersectionality affect political identity construction in discourse analysis? Intersectionality considers how different aspects of identity, such as race, gender, and class, intersect in shaping political identities. Discourse analysis reveals how these overlapping identities are constructed and negotiated in political discourse, reflecting broader social justice issues. How do social media and digital platforms contribute to political identity formation? Social media platforms allow for the rapid dissemination of political discourse, where individuals can express and reinforce their political identities through hashtags, memes, and personal narratives. Movements like #Black Lives Matter use digital discourse to create collective identities centered around activism and social justice. Which methods are used to analyze political identities in discourse analysis? Critical discourse analysis, CDA, focuses on how political identities relate to power structures and ideologies. Framing analysis investigates how issues, individuals, and groups are framed to shape political identities. Narrative analysis examines the stories and personal accounts that construct political identities. Metaphor analysis explores how metaphors simplify political ideologies and reinforce identities. Can you provide an example of how political identities are shaped in populist movements? In populist discourse, leaders often frame themselves as the voice of the people and construct political identities around this in-group. They position the elite as the out-group, blaming them for societal problems and presenting themselves as the saviors of the common people. What challenges arise in analyzing political identities through discourse? Complexity of identity. Political identities are fluid and shaped by various social factors, making them difficult to categorize. Analyst bias. Researchers must be aware of their own ideological biases when analyzing political identities. Contextual factors. The interpretation of political identities is influenced by cultural, historical, and social contexts, which must be carefully considered in analysis.